BBC Sounds.
Hi, I'm Susan Morrison.
And I'm Louise Yeoman.
And together we're the team that brings you Time Travels, BBC Radio Scotland's Scottish History magazine programme. But we're here today to talk to you about our new project. It's our first podcast, Witch Hunt. We will be investigating one of Scotland's biggest miscarriages of justice. Now, about 450 years ago, our country was convulsed by waves of savage panics and purges, leading to the judicial murder of thousands of our own citizens, mainly women.
Yeah, women who were convicted and executed for crimes they not only didn't commit, but which were impossible for anyone to commit. We're going to be exploring the Great War Scotland waged on Satan in the 16th and 17th century.
Let's just hear a flavour of what you can expect from Witch Hunt.
Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. You have to know that they believed that the witches had done the worst thing in the world, given up their soul for Satan to do his bidding.
I mean, people had believed in the devil for centuries, but they didn't really imagine that they might meet him in the street.
Meet him in the street?
Well, that was always a possibility. In the 16th century, the devil was always kind of lurking around the next corner. He was trying to lure you away from God.
The idea is that a witch is someone who says, right, I'm not going to have faith in God anymore. I'm not going to worship God anymore. My allegiance will instead be to God's great enemy, the devil.
Here in Scotland, you would be looking at the idea that this was somebody who could interfere with the crops, possibly cause hailstorms, who could cause farm animals to sicken, could cause perhaps your family members to sicken, a whole range of things.
Yeah, I mean, we know that it's not a possibility for people to have committed these crimes. But what you have to remember is that they thought that it was a possibility.
Now, the thing is, Louise, I can imagine some sections of Scottish society believing this stuff, but it's our whole country that gets convulsed by this, isn't it?
From the king right down. One of the things about this which really blows my mind is that it's the educated people who believe the wackiest things. They're the people who are really keen on this idea of the demonic pact, the witch selling her soul to the devil, and that, they believe, involves meeting the devil and having sex with him.
Ew. Well, over 6 episodes, we'll be connecting all of this up from when the witch hunts really got going to when they actually finished in the early 18th century. Join me and Louise and our cast of top-notch historians for Witch Hunt.
BBC Sounds.
Welcome to Witch Hunt, a podcast from BBC Radio Scotland. I'm Susan Morrison. About 450 years ago, Scotland was convulsed by waves of savage panics and purges, leading to the judicial murder of thousands of its own citizens, mainly women. Why? Over 6 episodes, we'll be looking at the Great War Scotland waged on Satan in the 16th and 17th centuries. Helping me get to grips with how this could possibly have happened will be our own resident historian, Dr. Louise Yeoman. Louise, where do we start with this huge subject?
We're going to start with one of the most important of the Scottish witch hunts, the North Berwick trials, and we're going to be using them to look at how people could come to be convicted and executed for imaginary crimes.
Imaginary crimes. We have got an outstanding team of historians to transport us back in time. We'll be hearing from Dr. Michelle Brock, Dr. Victoria Carr, Professor Julian Goodyear, Dr. Lizanne Henderson and Laura Moffat. Now, be warned, some of this stuff is truly disturbing. This is Witch Hunt.
Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. You have to know that they believed that the witches had done the worst thing in the world, given up their soul for Satan to do his bidding.
I mean, people had believed in the devil for centuries, but they didn't really imagine that they might meet him in the street.
Meet him in the street?
Well, that was always a possibility. In the 16th century, the devil was always kind of lurking around the next corner. He was trying to lure you away from God.
The idea is that a witch is someone who says, right, I'm not going to have faith in God anymore, I'm not going to worship God anymore, my allegiance will instead be to God's great enemy, the devil.
Here in Scotland, you would be looking at the idea that this was somebody who could interfere with the crops, possibly cause hailstorms, who could cause farm animals to sicken, could cause perhaps your family members to sicken, a whole range of things.
Yeah, I mean, we know that it's not a possibility for people to have committed these crimes. But what you have to remember is that they thought that it was a possibility.
So people really believe that their female neighbours are actually meeting Satan and they're selling their souls to him for just a wee bit of vengeance and some black magic.
Yeah, what you've got to remember is this is a very thoroughly Christian society. It's very conservative, as we'd say. They totally believe the devil is real. God is real too. This is God who sent his only son to save you. And if you turn against him and sell yourself out to the devil, that's horrible treason. And this particular witch hunt is when it also becomes treason to the king. And that's when things really blow up.
King? Which king?
James VI and first. He's James VI of Scots at this point. He's the king who really puts witch hunting on the map in Scotland. He's not King of England yet. He's waiting and hoping that that's going to drop into his lap. But that all depends on him surviving. He's an only child, an orphan, and the Stuart dynasty and all its grand plans hangs by a thread on the life of James. Now that's enough to make you paranoid and think everybody's plotting against you. And then this is where the weather comes into the picture.
Let's go to one of our history team on this, Dr. Martha McGill.
So in 1589 to 90, James VI is looking to get married to Princess Anne of Denmark. But when she's set to come over to Scotland, there are terrible storms that disrupt the process. James sails out, meets her at Norway and tries to bring her back, and they have more awful storms. The Danish then start having witch trials over this because they start to say, oh, maybe it's witches conjuring up the bad weather, trying to jeopardise the marriage. And James, when he gets back to Scotland, launches one of his own. So this then is the beginning of the North Berwick trials.
And it starts to look real. It starts to look credible.
Professor Julian Goodyear.
James certainly, on at least some occasions, interrogated some of these suspects, let's call them that, personally, and he seems to have thought that that was a good idea because you can see him doing it on later occasions too. He actually wants to hear these witches' stories, and he fancies himself as a sort of expert interrogator. He thinks he can find the right questions, and he's going to get to the bottom of this. So, yeah, he has a high opinion of himself as this sort of hands-on guy who has a sophisticated understanding of witchcraft and is going to get to the bottom of this.
Dr. Lizanne Henderson.
James becomes convinced that he is the direct target of the devil because he is the greatest enemy that the devil has in the world, which is, when you think about it, quite a preposterous, narcissistic thing to say. But again, if we're thinking about James as trying to present himself as this consummate ruler, a real kind of badass, that he's going to be able to take on the world and
the other world.
And the other world. He wants people to think this, that he's leading the charge, if you like, for the Protestant faith, presenting himself as a powerful leader, and he's got this eye to what's going on in England. He's got his eye on that audience as well and saying, look at me, I'm the man.
And I can deal with all of this.
I can deal with it.
So that is a totally gobsmacking description of James there by Lizanne Louise, isn't it?
Yeah, he thinks he's taking on Satan, and he really wants the English, his prospective subjects, to know that if he gets their throne, he, the King of Scots, they're not just getting any old monarch, they're getting the mighty enemy of the devil. And, you know, just to make sure they get the message, he has a propaganda pamphlet printed in England, and this is called News from Scotland. So he's making sure they can read all about it.
Okay, James is basically setting himself up as some kind of superhero. James, the mighty enemy of the devil.
Yeah, that's not so uncommon with witch hunters. Sometimes they sort of really do glorify themselves as the saviours of their communities. But where it gets really horrible is people are being accused of raising storms. Now, we all know people can't do that. So this is an imaginary crime. But these are real people. And they're also being accused of having gone to meet the devil in a kirkyard in North Berwick, getting powers from the devil, becoming witches, being able to raise all these storms. Now, these ordinary men and women are really going to suffer because the way you get people to confess to imaginary crimes is torture.
Torture. So let's dig into that with Mickey, Gillian, and Martha.
Live in North Berwick, the year 1590. And for the past year or so, and the beginnings of this are all quite fuzzy, there have been local accusations of witchcraft. And we don't have a lot of details, but something was in the air, something was in the ether. People were fearful of witches, people were being named. It was starting to bubble up to the surface. And in this context, there is a very unpleasant fellow, a guy called David Seaton from a fairly influential family in the area, and he becomes concerned about the various nocturnal comings and goings of his servant, Geely Duncan.
Being a propertied man with power, he can just arrest her in his own house and torture her as a sort of private enterprise thing, and this doesn't seem to have led to any raised eyebrows.
So the idea is that if you torture someone, it'll compel the guilty people to confess and the innocent will be protected by God.
So torture is a useful ally as far as the witch hunters are concerned?
Absolutely, yes. And it's not necessarily... I mean, it seems ridiculous to us nowadays, of course, that you can count this as a legitimate confession, one that you've extracted from physical torments. But again, there's this idea that God's there to protect the witch if she's actually innocent. If she's guilty, this is how you find it out. And she starts to say, well, actually, she's got this pact with the devil. She's been meeting with the devil and with other witches, dancing, drinking, having feasts on the side of the sea. And they've been summoning up these storms to attack the king and his new bride.
He gets her to confess to a range of sort of activities and, more importantly, to name names.